Okay. So just to review, the lecture exam is 50 questions. 40 are multiple choice. 10 at the end are fill in the blanks. It's going to cover skeletal, joints, muscles, and nervous system. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's about 12 to 13 questions per chapter. Now the muscles is actually 2 chapters, and the nervous is 2, because there's central nervous system, and then the nervous tissue, and then muscles has the muscles, and then the muscle contraction. Okay. All right. So the questions are grouped together. So the first set of questions you'll see will be on the skeletal. The next set will be on joints, muscles, nervous, and then the 10 and the 10 last one, fill in the blank, has about 2 to 3 questions per chapter. Then for the lab exam, 30 questions, and they are all fill in the blanks. So identifying, fill in blank. So you type in the answer. Similar to your quizzes. Spelling counts. Make sure, I saw some of this on your quizzes, make sure there are no abbreviations. Okay, so if there's an abbreviation, I have to deduct it as if it was a spelling error. So make sure there's no abbreviations. If there's a pair of something, make sure you indicate whether it's right or left. I don't think there are pairs yet in this unit. So I don't think you have to worry about this until the next unit. So I'll just put brackets over there. Spelling counts, okay. And then for everything, make sure you're using Respondus lockdown. Have your webcam on. And there were a few students last time that didn't do the correct kind of the environmental scan. Until scan. And I just want to say how important that is, because if you are flagged and you didn't do an appropriate environmental scan, I can't grade your exam. Otherwise, I have to send it to the person above me to kind of look through it to see if there's any academic disintegrity. Okay, so just make sure, cover your, like I said, I don't watch this unless Respondus flags you, but just make sure you do a proper environmental scan. So let me give you an example of what one looks like. So last time, there were a few students that just did something like this. Okay, that doesn't tell me much. I want to see kind of what's at your table, what's around you. Okay, so things like that. Okay, so make sure you're covering your right side and your left side. Okay, not just up and down. Okay, up and down doesn't tell me much. I want to see what's around you. Okay, and you should have it mine is not a great example because mine's really packed right now, but it should be pretty clear. There shouldn't be any cell phones by you. Okay, so that should not be near you when you're taking the exam. Any questions? Okay, let me stop that and go back to writing. Okay, so the environmental scan we talked about, respondents. Any questions on the logistics of the exam? Okay. So then the next one, let's start with skeletal. So with skeletal, things you should know is the types of bones. Is it short, flat, irregular, or long? And I did put a mark on long because that's the one that we're going to focus on. And some sample questions might be, okay, so you have the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone would be an example of what type of bone?
That's interesting that you chose that one. I was just thinking about that one. So you mean the type of bone or where it's located, or what are you, I'm
What
sorry, what are
type
you,
of bone is it? Would it be classified as short, flat, irregular, or long?
I don't know. I mean, I know it's the cheekbone. I guess it would be, well, I remember it as the cheekbone. That's the way I used to remember it. It, it's,
Is it short or irregular?
Which one?
Irregular?
That's correct. Very good. It is irregular. Okay. So that's the type of questions you would see on the exam is, here's this bone, what kind is it? Okay. Or I can say, what bone is, the width is larger than the length. Okay. So, or if where the height and the width is equal to each other, that would be short bones. Flat bones would be where the width is greater than the height and things like that. So those are the types of questions you can see from that first bullet point. Okay. Then you should also know the functions of bone: movement, stabilization, protection, red blood cell production, and mineral storage. But you also want to know a little bit more about them. So what do I mean by movement? What do I mean by stabilization? What do I mean by protection? And what do I mean by red blood cell production and mineral storage? So you want to be able to not just regurgitate movement, stabilization, protection, but also understand what they mean. And that's why on the worksheets that I had you do, some are required for you to submit, but I have worksheets for every single chapter. So that's one of the things I would recommend for you to study for the exam, is go through the worksheets regardless of whether they were due for you to submit on Canvas or not. So in that worksheet, it will always say list and describe the functions. Okay. Then the third thing you should know is the anatomy of a long bone. Make sure you understand the structure and the function. So let's start with this first. Let's do a labeling game. So here and here, what would you call that? The ends of a long bone. What would the ends of a long bone be? The epiphysis, exactly. Okay. And the shaft of long bone would be what?
Dialysis?
The diaphysis. Yeah, very good. Okay. Then you have these areas in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So what would you call this?
Metaphysis?
Metaphysis. What's another name for it?
I'm not sure.
It's okay. There's 10 other classmates. What's another name for number 3 besides the metaphysis?
Is it something canal maybe?
No? Good guess though. It's also known as the epiphyseal plates. Okay. A layman's term for that would be the growth plate. So when you hit puberty, the growth hormone targets this area, the metaphysis / the epiphyseal plates. And what will happen is that your bone elongates. So you grow taller, and it's at this spot right here. Okay. So let's do 1 is the epiphysis. 2, the diaphysis. 3, the metaphysis, or the epiphyseal plates. And in terms of function, Your epiphyseal plates starts out as what material and develops into what when it starts to grow? What's the starting material along your epiphyseal plate before you grow taller?
Red marrow?
No?
Oh.
Good guess. It's actually going to be hyaline cartilage. And the hyaline cartilage at puberty is going to convert into bone tissue. And that's why it's known as your growth plates. Okay? Then you have this hollow space right in here. So let's make that number 4. What is this hollow space in here? So Matt, what we're covering right now is stuff that would be on your lecture exam.
Can you point to what you're talking about again?
Sure, number 4. It does contain bone marrow, but what is it called, Matt?
Is it the marrow cavity?
That's right, the medullary cavity. Okay, and it does contain bone marrow. Okay, so what kind of bone marrow does it contain? Because you have 3 different types of bone marrow. You have red bone marrow, you have yellow bone marrow, and gelatinous bone marrow. Where is it going to?
As
Yes.
kids, it has red, and then adults is yellow.
That's right. So it starts off as red bone marrow, and then it transitions to yellow bone marrow as you become an adult. And as you age and become elderly, it actually becomes gelatinous. Okay. So does that mean as adults, you no longer make red blood cells? Because it transitions to yellow as an adult. So does that mean that you no longer make red blood cells as an adult?
You still make them, right?
You still make them? Yep. Where? So RBC production is associated with the red bone marrow. Okay. But when you age, where does it occur then? You will find that along the epiphysis, the ends of a long bone, you will find that it contains spongy bone marrow or spongy bone tissue. And in the spongy bone tissue, you will also have red bone marrow. Okay, so actually it's in your epiphysis where there's spongy bone tissue that you actually will have red blood cells being produced throughout your whole life. Where in the medullary cavity, it's only red as when you're younger, but then when you become an adult, it does transition to yellow. Okay. All right. Then let's take a look at this. So around the epiphysis only, you find another substance that covers it. What is this substance called?
Articular cartilage.
Very good. So 5 is articular cartilage. What's the function of the articular cartilage?
I'm just guessing, is it to protect and cushion the bones?
You are correct. So it protects the bone from bone-to-bone friction. If any of you have or know someone that has arthritis, that's bone-to-bone friction. It's very painful because there's a lot of blood vessels and nerves along the bone. So when the two articulating bones, meaning they work together at joints to allow for movement. So when there's two articulating bones that rub against each other, that's very painful. So that's why we have the articular cartilage around it. But as you age, the articular cartilage will start to wear out in some people. So that's why the function of the articular cartilage to protect from bone-to-bone friction. Okay, what is it made up of? What does it consist of?
Hyaline cartilage?
Yeah. Hyaline cartilage, very good. Okay, then around the diaphysis, you will also have a substance surrounding it. What's this substance called? Kind of depends, right? There's 6A and then there's 6B, which is the kind of the inside area. So 6A would be called what? The one on the outside.
Does it start with a P?
Yes, it does, ma'am.
Is it I don't know how to say it. Peritinosium?
Periosteum. Great job. You did great. I love it. So peri means around, osteum means bone. So whenever you see the term osteum, it means bone. Peri meaning around. So it's the substance that wraps around the bone, particularly the diaphysis. Okay, so 6A is the periosteum, okay, where 6B, since it's on the inside, would be called the what? Endosteum. Okay, and the endosteum is important because as an adult, when you break a bone, so if you were, let's say, break a bone, okay, your bone has to heal, and it's going to heal from the outside inwards because along the endosteum, you will find what type of bone cell? You can find osteogenic, and osteogenic are the bone stem cells. Okay, so you can find osteogenic cells here, and that's why when bone, as an adult, when bone fractures, it's going to heal from the outside inwards. Okay, questions?
So for the periosteum, do we need to know like the outer layer and inner layer and like exactly what they do? Or
Yep. Yes, ma'am. Yep. Okay. Other questions or follow-up questions?
Audrey, can you repeat that question you just asked?
yeah, I said for the periosteum, if we would need to know like the inner and outer layers and like their functions and what they do.
Yep. So you need to know that it's the periosteum. It covers the outside of the diaphysis. And you need to know that the inside is called the endosteum, And that's where you can find osteogenic cells, which means that it allows for bone healing from outside inwards. Bone repair. Okay. All right. So let's say I took a cut of this. Let's say I cut it right here. So if I made a cut right here, okay, and you're seeing that same cut down here, let's try to use the same colors. I have blue first. Oh, oh, weird. Blue. There we go. Okay, so this is a cut of the bone. Oh, bone. B. There we go. That means that this right here is what? So Matt, yes, it is the components and function you need to know. Yep. So structure and function. So with the microscopic anatomy, so if I made a cut of, I cut the long bone, what are you seeing here? What am I drawing? What's this first outer circle represent right here?
Is it the osteon?
Nope, this is not the osteon. So what you're seeing along here, this would be the periosteum or periosteum. Osteum. Okay. And then that would make this inner circle what?
The endosteum?
Nope, not the endosteum. But let me draw the endosteum. So the endosteum would be right here. The central canal, not the central canal yet. That's a great question though, because that's what students answer all the time, Anna. So thank you. But it's not the end, it's not the central canal. So if you look right here, if I cut right here in this red line right here, with the first circle that you saw was the periosteum and the endosteum. What would the center circle be called right here? Number 4. Make a guess. Being wrong here is the best thing to do because studies show that if you answer something, regardless of whether it's correct or incorrect, you're more likely to remember it. So this is the safest place to be wrong. So just give me answers or give me replies.
Medullary cavity.
Perfect. It's the medullary cavity. Okay. So this is what students struggle with. This concept of like seeing what things are. Okay. So I need you to make sure you understood what these things are before I drew these things in. Okay. So along between the periosteum, endosteum, and the medullary cavity, along the diaphysis, you will find these things. It's like circles within circles. It's like an onion. You know, you peel one away, you get another. Okay. So what are these green circles representing? What are
Is it
these?
osteons?
That's an osteon. Perfect. Okay, so that's an osteon. So now I'm going to zoom in on one osteon. So what I'm drawing now, that is an osteon. And the problem is that the osteon looks just like the cut of the diaphysis. But now this is an osteon. So that means that the center right here, now, Anna, you can say that that is the central canal. Okay, now along the central canal, well, the central canal is just a hollow space, right? So the central canal will have blood vessels and nerves running through it, okay? But you'll also find these pockets in an osteon. Looks very similar to where it originally came from. What am I drawing here?
Osteoblast?
Not osteoblast. Good guess though. Very good guess. But osteoblasts are the bone building cells. So these little things right here are actually referred to as the lacunas, the little legs. So the lacuna is a space that houses a cell called not an osteoblast, but an come on, not an osteoblast, but an
Class?
not an osteoclast. Osteoclasts are
Osteocyte?
bone dissolving. Sorry?
Osteocyte?
There you go. So the lacuna is at the little lake that contains the osteocytes. Very good. Okay. Now you can see that the lacunas are not, it's not just the lacunas, right? There's these little extensions to them right here. Can't see it very clear, but these little channels in between them. Okay. So these little channels right here are called what? So the house itself, so this whole structure right here is a lacuna. Then the lacunas have these little extensions or these channels between them. So what are these things called? Exactly. Exactly. So the canaliculi right here. Okay. So the canaliculi allows the so the lacuna, that should be an A, lacuna. Okay. So the lacuna houses the osteocyte, where the canaliculi houses the dendrites. So the extensions, these things right here, it allows for one osteocyte to communicate with another, but it also allows for the exchange of waste and nutrients. It's just a pathway to allow things to move back and forth. Okay. So that's the canaliculi. Okay. Now Anna typed in the lamella. So the lamella is actually the matrix that's formed. So let's talk about the lamella. Let's see it. Let's use yellow. So you can see that these layers looks kind of like a little Twinkie, right? It has these layers right here, these concentric rings. Do you see these concentric rings right here? In the yellow, those are concentric rings of matrix called the lamella. Okay, so the lamella is concentric rings of matrix. What's matrix? Looks kind of like a Twinkie, or the cream inside of a Twinkie. But what's the matrix? It's made up of two things. It's going to include ground substance and fibers. Okay, since this is bone, what specific fiber are you going to find mostly? What specific fibers would you find in bone? You have three fibers, right? You have elastic, you have reticular, and you have collagen. What makes sense to be found in bone? So elastic allows for flexibility, collagen allows for strength, and reticular allows for kind of filtering. So what makes sense to be found in bone?
Collagen.
Yes, perfect. So you find collagen here. The ground substance that you will find in bone in this particular one, or in bone, in this particular connective tissue would be what? What's the ground substance that you find in bone? We hear about it all the time, right? You drink this to make bones really strong.
Protein?
Not protein.
Calcium.
Close. Calcium. So you find calcium phosphate here. That's the ground substance. And where do you find the ground substance and the fibers? You find it along the concentric rings called the lamella. Okay, so it's kind of like packing material. So the lamella is packing material, and then between the packing material, you'll find the lacunae and the canaliculi. Okay, just imagine it has like bubble wrap filled with calcium phosphate and collagen. And then in between those rows of bubble wrap, you will find the lacunae, the pockets or the space that houses the osteocyte. And then the canaliculi are the channels that connect their dendrites. Make sense? Questions? So lastly, we have the perforating canal. So the central canal was important, right? Because we said that the central canal allows for blood vessels and nerves to run through. So does that mean that only the areas closest to the central canal can get blood and nerve supply? No. So what you'll find is that, so imagine the central canal actually moving, never changes color. There we go. Moves along this whole length. Okay, so here's this osteon. An osteon looks like a tube. Okay, just imagine like a bunch of you're holding a bunch of pens that wrap around. Okay, so each pen is an osteon. Now along the length of this, you will find that the central canal branches outwards like this. And when it branches outward, that's where you will find the perforating canal, and that will bring the blood supply and nerves to the outer areas of the osteon. Okay, questions? All right, let's move on. We have the cells, we have the osteogenic cells, the osteoblast, osteocyte, and osteoclast. Make sure you know what they are. So osteogenic cells are the stem cells. In other words, they're highly mitotic. What does highly mitotic mean?
Reproduced rapidly.
Yes, it divides, okay, and reproduces, okay? Now the osteogenic cells will become the osteoblast, okay? And that's why you see this arrow right here. So it becomes the osteoblast. And what I used to remember, and you can use whatever way you want, but B in blast means B in building. So what's going to happen is it becomes these osteoblasts, and the osteoblast builds the bone. What do we mean by saying it builds the bone? Remember in the previous one right here, the bone substance itself, the packing material, that's the lamella. And what exactly is the lamella? That's the ground substance in the fibers, right? So what do we mean by saying that the osteoblast builds bone? It goes like this. So here's the osteoblast, right? And then what it's going to do is that it's going to collect packing material. It's going to put some collagen here, put some the fibers, the calcium. It's going to pack the substances around it. And guess what? When it packs the matrix around itself, it traps itself inside this cavity. What is that cavity called?
The medullary?
No. What's that cavity called? Let me use the right color to match the previous slide. Others. What's this cavity called? When it packs, it creates this hollow cavity around itself. And kind of keeps packing the materials until it becomes trapped. So that cavity is called the lacuna. So you can see that it starts off as an osteoblast. It's going to build the bone substance, which is the lamella, essentially, the collagen and the calcium phosphate. And when it becomes trapped and it can no longer build, it then becomes an osteocyte. And that's why we say, what is housed in a lacuna? It's a cell that's trapped, right? So it's not technically building bone, it's trapped in there. So now it's called an osteocyte rather than an osteoblast, which it was originally when it was building the matrix around itself. Okay, so these three cells right here are related to each other. An osteogenic cell becomes an osteoblast. It builds the bone, the matrix, and aka the packing material, the lamella, until it becomes trapped and forms a space called the lacunae. Then once it becomes trapped, it is now called an osteocyte. It maintains the bone matrix, but it does not build it because it's not capable of building anymore because it's trapped, okay? A separate cell that you'll find is an osteoclast, class as in C, okay? So an osteoclast is unique. It doesn't come from any of the other three. It's its own cell, and it's the bone dissolving cell. The reason for that is because of this location right here. Do you see that this is called the ruffled border? The ruffled border of an osteoclast contains digestive enzymes that allow it to break down the bone matrix. Okay, so not a lot of people understand that your bone is in a constant change. Is once it's built, it doesn't mean that it stays that way. It's actually building, rebuilding, bringing it down, rebuilding, bringing it down, rebuilding. There's a homeostasis of it. Why? Why is it important to build and break down bone material? What's in it that you need in your body, in your bloodstream?
Oxygen?
Not oxygen, but you do need oxygen, but this is not a part of this. Okay, so go back to the function of bone. Function of bone includes red blood cell production. It includes movement, stabilization, mineral storage. What mineral is it storing? How? Where? What? Why?
Calcium?
Yes, that's it. So bone is storing calcium, and calcium is always needed in blood. You don't know it now, but you will when we get to the next set of, you did already. You learned about muscle. Muscle needs calcium all the time, right? It needs calcium to start the action potential. It needs calcium to bind to troponin and tropomyosin so that it can release itself from actin. So you know that our body needs calcium in our blood, not just our body. Our bloodstream needs to have a certain level of calcium. So calcium normally is stored in bone tissue, and that's why it's constantly, because when we think of bone, we think of something very static and non-changing, right? But that's not true. It's changing all the time. It's building, breaking down, building, breaking down. It's helping to maintain that homeostasis of calcium levels. So if you get stranded in a mountain and you have no source of calcium, guess what's going to happen? Your bone tissue is going to break down a little bit to release the calcium that it's currently storing, so it can go into your blood, and then the other functions of your body can use that calcium. Okay, but if you are, if you ingest a lot of calcium, you don't want too high of a level of calcium in blood. So what's going to happen is that it's going to stimulate the osteoblast to take that calcium from blood and store it in that packing material that we call the lamella. Okay. So there's a constant homeostasis between the osteoblast and the osteoclast to build bone tissue and to release it depending on what calcium levels you need in your bloodstream. It's kind of cool. Before I learned about this, I'm like, oh, bone is static, right? No, it's not. It's actually constantly changing. Make sense? Oh, I see that Jeremy put calcium. Thank you, Jeremy. Okay. All right. So we got to move on, make sure I get to the muscle. I'm taking way too much time on this other stuff. Okay. So you should also know that there's bone tissue. Make sure you cover the compact bone, the spongy bone tissue. And then in terms of bone formation, understand the basics. You don't need to go like step by step, but you need to know the basics. In other words, what's the starting material? What type of bone do they make? Between endochondrial and intramembranous. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then this is, I like to include this because this is kind of how we did it already, but this is just a nice cleaner. This is I took a picture of the whiteboard that I do for my in-class version of this class. So it's just kind of going through the exact same thing. And you can use this to quiz yourself because I purposely didn't label things. I just left it as A, B, C. So you can use it to quiz yourself. Okay. All right. For joints is mostly like 90% memorization. You just need to know it. It's a lot of terms that sound the same. Synarthrosis, syndesmosis, symphysis, so on. So a lot of syns are S-Y-N, because it means joints, okay? So you want to make sure you just have a nice cognitive map so that you can visualize it instead of having to memorize all the terms, okay? So do the combination of visualization and memorization will help you be able to distinguish it. So I started this chart for you. So there's fibrous joints. In terms of fibrous joints, what is the structure? It's made up of fibers. What kind of movement range does it allow? It's synarthrosis, in other words, no movement. What are some examples that you need to know? Sutures, gomphosis, and syndesmosis. So now you need to make sure you fill in for the other three. Okay, so you have fibrous, you have synovial, you have cartilaginous. All right, so make sure you fill it all in. Okay. Another thing you should focus on is the structure and function of synovial joints. So make sure you know what a meniscus is, a bursa, synovial capsule, synovial cavity, articular cartilage, and hopefully this image will help you kind of place where things are. I would recommend going back into this image and writing down their function as well. So what's the function of an articular cartilage? We already covered that, right? What would the ligament do? What would the tendons do? What would the bursa do? What would the synovial cavity do? Okay. All right. Muscles. All right. So we have let's see, what time is it? You have a little bit of time. I apologize, I went over a little bit. So if you can stay, awesome. If you can't, it is recorded. Okay. So in terms of muscle, make sure you know muscle function and structure. Make sure you know the neuromuscular junction, the sliding filament theory, and metabolism. Okay. So muscles, lots of physiology. Okay. So here's physiology. Here's physiology. Here's physiology. Okay. So make sure you set aside a lot of time to look at muscles and nervous. And I did another, I think I made 2 recordings for you in the muscles because it tends to be a little bit more difficult. Make sure you watch the videos on those. The videos include the sliding filament theory and metabolism. So hopefully you are getting all the video links. Just make sure you watch them, okay? All right. So in terms of breaking down the structure of a muscle, you need to start here. Because if you don't understand this initial first page, you're not going to understand the rest. It's not going to make any sense. And that's why in your worksheet, I had you draw it out. Some of you were really detailed, but there were others that I could tell were kind of, not quite sure about where things are. And if you don't know where things are, it's harder to understand how they connect, okay? So you can see that from a bone, the bone is connected to the muscle through a tendon, and the tendon connects the periosteum to the muscle. Okay, then if we were to look at the muscle itself, okay, so the muscle group is this large chunk of muscle right here. Just imagine if you're like eating a piece of chicken, you peel the chicken, it comes out in like these strands, right? So that's what this is, okay? So this is like a strand of the muscle. Now that, just like if you were eating onto a drummy of a chicken, it has that fatty layer on the outside, that delicious fatty layer. That fatty layer is made up of connective tissue, and that connective tissue is called, you have epimysium. Okay, so fascias, you have 3 levels of fascia covering each level of how the muscle is broken down. So the first muscle group is surrounded by an epimysium. Then what makes the muscle group are these fascicles, these bundles of fascicles. And the fascicles are surrounded by another fat layer called the perimysium. And then the perimysium is made up of smaller bundles called the muscle fiber or the muscle cell. Okay, now the muscle, here's another confusing thing for students. Muscle cell and muscle fiber are used interchangeably. Good grief, right? Because you just learned that there are 3 types of fibers. There's collagen, there is reticular and elastic. Well, here's the problem. The muscle cell doesn't look like the typical round cell that you have been learning about. Muscle cells are long. And because they're long, they look like a fiber. So whenever you hear the term muscle fiber, it actually refers to a muscle cell. So the next question is then, well, what do you call the fibers of a muscle then? Well, we use the term myofibrils and myofilaments instead of just plain fibers. So that's one like conceptual weirdness that you can find in this chapter. So a muscle fiber actually refers to the muscle cell, okay? So the muscle fiber is surrounded by a fat layer as well, called the endomysium. All right. So if I were to zoom in on a muscle fiber, aka a muscle cell, now you would look at something similar. So the muscle fiber also contains a plasma membrane, but they must have really loved torturing students because they renamed everything for the same structures that you learned about in the cell. Plasma membrane, nucleus, mitochondria, all the organelles and everything, a lot of them have different names, even though it's the same thing and same function, okay? So instead of being the plasma membrane, it is now called the sarcolemma. Instead of being called the cytoplasm, it is now called the sarcoplasm. Instead of being called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, it is now called the what? Who knows this one? The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is now called the what?
Sarcoplasmic reticulum.
Exactly. That's just crazy, right? I'm like, why can't they just keep the same name? But whoever did it decided not to. So unfortunately, you have to know their specific names as well. Okay, so that's what the inside of a muscle cell would look like. It would have lots of mitochondria. Makes sense because it needs a lot of energy, more than other tissues in the body. Okay, it would have a lot of sarcoplasmic reticulum. Makes sense because it needs a lot of calcium. So in certain tissues, you will find more abundant organelles than others depending on what it needs. Okay, so because muscle cells need to do a lot of movement, which require a lot of energy, it makes sense then it would have lots of mitochondria. It will have its own protein that carries oxygen called, what protein would you find in cells that carry oxygen? Myoglobin. Myo meaning muscle, globin meaning protein, okay? So like you have hemoglobin, right? Here you have myoglobin. So myoglobin is a protein that you find in a muscle cell that carries oxygen, okay? So make sure you go through the things that you find inside of the cell of a muscle, okay? Now, in addition to all those organelles, it's gonna have lots of fibers, okay? And the fibers run through the whole length of the cell of a muscle, okay? And it's going to be split up by what we call sarcomeres. And sarcomeres are formed by the Z disc. Connected to the Z disc would be actin. In between the Z disc would be the myosin, okay? So make sure you kind of go through the structure of what the inside of a muscle fiber looks like. Questions? For assignment 7, there are 4 units. So do we create 12 questions? So Tabitha, the questions aren't for me necessarily, but more for you. So the more questions you create, the more self-quizzes you've made. So that's why I have you make them. So I essentially, if you make one set, I will give you full credit for that. But if you can make more sets, that's more useful for you because you can use that as a self-quiz. Did that answer? So, yep. Are the questions short answer, multiple choice, true, false? And do some of the questions in the lecture exam give us a picture to so like this? No. So Matt, it's just like the exam that you had last time. There's usually no pictures. And it's going to be mostly multiple choice, 40 questions in multiple choice, true, false. and then 10 questions, short answer at the end. Okay, all right. So I don't think I will have time, and I apologize for that. I should have just started out with the muscle contraction. But here's an image from, I did make the video on this though, so I would recommend watching the video on muscle contraction as well as muscle contraction and muscle metabolism. So make sure you watch those two videos, okay? And then just to kind of end with the nervous system. So the nervous system, how it's divided, it's nice to kind of have this cognitive map right here. You can see that the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes sensory nerves and motor nerves. Of the sensory nerves, it can be divided into somatic sensory nerves and visceral sensory nerves. The motor is also divided similarly. There's visceral motor nerves and somatic motor nerves. So let's start with what's the difference between sensory and motor? Why do we have two divisions for this? Why is there a difference? It's in the direction that they carry information, right? So the nerves carry information. So sensory is always going to go from the environment into the central nervous system, where motor is going to carry information from the central nervous system to the environment. Okay. Then what's the difference between somatic and visceral? So somatic is often associated with things that you have control over, and visceral tends to be things that you don't have control over. And we really focus on that under the motor units. So under visceral motor, this is also known as the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the visceral motor division. And under autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. You don't have control over either, but they control different functions of your body. Okay, so you do not have control over either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic because it's autonomic. Okay, but they have different functions. So the sympathetic takes care of your flight or fight responses, where your parasympathetic takes care of your rest and digest. All right. Then make sure you know the structure of a spinal cord and examples of how a neuron would fit into that. So let's take a look at this neuron right here. This neuron that I'm tracing in red. First of all, what kind of neuron is that? Is it a sensory or a motor neuron? A sensory or motor neuron?
Is it a sensory?
Sensory neurons are taking information from the environment and sending it to the central nervous system. So if you look at a neuron, here's the structure of a neuron. It has the soma right here, the axon, followed by the synaptic knob. Okay, it carries information in one direction only. It receives information at the dendrites and transmits the information at the synaptic knob. So if the head, the soma, is inside the central nervous system and the end is here, that makes this neuron what kind of neuron? So it receives information from the central nervous system and it sends it to the environment out here. So what kind of neuron is this?
Motor.
It's a motor, exactly. Where this one right here, let me do it in a different color. This one right here, has the soma outside and sending the information here. What kind of neuron would that be? That's the other one, right? The sensory. It's taking information from the environment, sending it to the central nervous system. Okay? So use that to kind of help you visualize and put things in place. You also want to make sure you know the central nervous system. So the parts of the brain, you have 4 main parts of the brain. You have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Under the brainstem, there are 3 subparts you need to know. That includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So not only should you know these parts, but you should also know their function. Okay? All right. Then spend a lot of time on nerve impulse conduction. That's a hard one as well. Okay? But I don't know if I made a video on this. If I didn't, I will make it for you this weekend and post it. Has anyone seen a video on the nerve impulse conduction?
I didn't see one.
Okay, I'll look. If I did not make one, I'll make one for y'all, since we didn't have time to cover it in this review. Okay, but essentially, it's the electrophysiology. So you start off with resting membrane potential right here. Let me use a different color. You start off with resting membrane potential. And if you want a signal to be sent, you go into a local potential, then it becomes an action potential. Okay? And kind of the characteristics of these are located below. It's good, it's helpful to learn about the electrophysiology using this right here. Okay, because that can show you the amounts, and you will, I rarely ever make you memorize amounts, but this is one where you will need to know that at resting membrane, it means to be at -70. Local potential means between -70 to -55. Okay, so a 15 millivolt difference. And then an action potential occurs between -55 to +35. Okay, so make sure you know these charts and know these numbers as well. Okay, and that's why if ever I put these numbers like this, that means you need to know them. Okay. Action potential, make sure you understand the difference between depolarization versus repolarization.